Where are going to be some of the top areas to buy in 2025? We've assembled 5 of the best property experts in the country to share their top picks from our top 25 pressure list. You can download the full list using the link below, which shares 25 suburbs from every state showing the highest pressure moving forward for 2025. But with around 200 areas on the list, we wanted to help narrow it down using our 5 experts, sharing their top pick on the list, their bottom pick on the list, and which state's going to grow the most in 2025. Kicking it off, head of research and founder of InvestorKit, Arjun Paliwal, focusing on what the data says to bring you his top pick on the list.
Firstly, pressure trends are super tight. But the second thing is the outer rings of these markets have seen strong levels of growth over the last 4 years.
Next up, Simon Liu, founder of Housefinder with a portfolio worth over $40 million, specializing in buying below market value with massive equity boosts up front.
In the past 12 months, 95,000 people migrated. So that's a lot of people that need houses. That trend is not slowing down.
But how does a developer look at this list? To find out, we talk with Rob Flux, head of the Property Developer Network.
We don't want to be buying where there's a peak. Probably the biggest driver that I'm looking at is population growth, and more specifically.
Now we're going to talk to a data analyst, and who better than founder of Suburbs Finder, Gilbert Melgar, here to go through the numbers with a fine-tooth comb with his top pick and bottom pick on the list.
The rising population drives demand. It ticks most of the boxes in terms of showcasing the relationship between supply and demand.
And finally, Sam Gordon, founder of APS and Buyer's Agent of the Year, who's built a staggering 100+ property portfolio by the age of 35, and who almost never talks locations on a podcast up until now.
So much of what I choose when I look at an area comes down to affordability metrics, how much we actually think has left in the tank. If we're looking at where's probably going to perform the strongest, it's all going to come down to...
This top 25 pressure list has been carefully designed to show you some of the highest pressure locations in each state. But if you're a regular listener to the show, you'll know all states aren't created equally. And depending on where you were thinking of investing in 2025, understanding the contrast between states that this list clearly shows you and the expert opinion you're about to hear could completely change the trajectory of your 2025. My name's Todd Sloan. You're listening to the Pizza and Property Podcast. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, make sure to hit that sub button below so you don't miss an episode in 2025 and make this the year you absolutely smash your property investing goals. But right now, you're listening to my chat with Arjun Paliwal, Simon Liu, Rob Flux, Gilbert Melgar, and Sam Gordon for their top pick, bottom pick, and which state's going to grow the most in 2025. Arjun Paliwal, you are looking bright and happy, mate.
Mate, it's that time of year. I thought I'd get into the Christmas spirit. You know, it's Christmas, New Year time now, so that break is definitely when I pull out the Hawaiian shirts.
Matt, I love it. Brightens you up, dude. Like, now I wanted to get into this one with you because I know that you're on a pretty tight deadline this morning as well. You've got a pretty chockers day. So I wanted to talk about the bottom pick on the list, the top pick on the list, and then the state that you and your data analytics team feel has the best chance for growth moving into 2025. So do you want to get the bad news out the way first and jump into the bottom pick on the list?
Yeah, let me give you the bad news here. So the bad news starts with the suburb in ACT. I'm not looking at any good times really ahead for the suburb of Holder in ACT. Now, Holder, one of the big reasons there is that we're seeing a mixture of a couple of things. Firstly, if you have markets that have weakness across the price market and the rental market, that's usually not a good sign. So currently vacancy rates in Holder are above 3.5%. They're about 3.65 right now. Also, in terms of the last few years, price growth's not been much at all. We've only seen upwards of about 5% growth over the last 3 years. Now, we do anticipate that to change in the future, but not right now. The ACT cycle just isn't looking pretty. And that's a suburb there that's not standing out because price pressure is fairly low in most areas. Yes, it's got lower inventory, which definitely can help, but a lot of other trends aren't supporting it to be a strong choice for me in terms of capital growth in the year 2025.
Okay, and just out of interest, when you say that, like you are expecting it to pick up, but more longer term, are we talking like a year, 2 years longer term, or are you talking more like 5, 10 years, like really like down the growth cycle?
Yeah, I'm talking a little bit further down the growth cycle. So not really something in the immediate. I think ACT is just still in a bit of a bad place overall when it comes to the overall supply, the rental market, its price pressure. It just hasn't seen any solid activity that's suggesting that a strong growth rate is ahead.
And is there like one key thing that you'd be looking for to change to go, okay, now it's time? Or is it more like, no, it's a collection of all of these things?
For me, it's always been a collection of things, right? I always like to go through what I call the macro, micro on the ground filters. So the macro starts with the economy, people movement, infrastructure spend per capita, some of the confidence going into the area. And then you come down to the micro and you're starting to go to pressure trends. How quickly places are selling, how much they're selling for and their asking prices, supply in terms of listing availability versus sales volumes, and the list continues into vendor discounting and beyond. And then we're also looking at on the rental side, which I pointed out, the rental market's not that pretty over there. And another statistic is days on market, also not that pretty as well. And so when you're looking at all of these factors, the pressure just isn't there. And then when we go on the ground, all it takes is a few open homes, a few visits, phone calls around the block to see what's happening. And when they start seeing the picture change across all three, you've got the start of a spark or a fuse in a market starting to pick up.
Gotcha, man. All right. Anything else you want to talk about with Holder and ACT before we move on to your top pick?
Yeah, look, all I'd say is that there has been a little bit of recovery in sales volumes, but nothing mind-blowing. Like to give you some insights, sales volumes haven't always been super high in this area. It's a bit of a tightly held in terms of not huge amounts of activity in the area, but they've been higher than some earlier years, which could be the start of some recovery, but it's still too early on in that market from an actual recovery taking shape. We're still seeing days on market pretty elevated there. And I think until that starts shifting, we won't see a tightening and fast-growing market in that suburb.
And I guess for anyone that's a little bit newer, this is exactly what you're talking about. If you were to just look at that indicator in isolation and go, sales volumes like that, this is looking good. It can give you a bit of a false positive, but you're looking at the bigger picture going, hold on, there's a bit more that actually needs to come together to make this add up.
Absolutely. We've got to look at it holistically because there can be moments where more people are buying, but what happens if there's not enough volume of sales as a total? And even though it's more than last year, it's not a huge amount overall. So that's a stat that you can look at data in different ways. Or if it's an example, lots of buying, but there's also lots of listings available. So it's only relative that there should be more buying happening because there's more available, but it's not really higher amounts that in comparison to low listings. So I think the key here is to look at demand holistically with supply, not just any isolated indicator.
Got it. All right, man, moving on to your top pick. Where's it looking good for 2025?
Yeah, this is tough because as you know, firstly, I'm going to always say any individual portfolio, you should look at it to what your portfolio needs because what I might say here might not be suitable for your portfolio where you need to go or your budget. But to me, even though WA has slowed down a little bit from last year, people forget that we're slowing down from 25% growth levels in 1 year down to about 15 to 20. And so this is still monstrous levels of growth in a city. It's just that people sometimes react to something saying, oh, it's over, it's stopping, it's going to go crazy. Better get out. Everyone's stopping. No one's looking at it. Well, long-term averages are about 5% for the city of Perth. So if you're at 5% long-term averages and you're between 15 to 20%, that's more than triple. Yeah. Right? Absolutely. And so this is taking us to WA, and the suburb in particular I want to point out is Warwick. So I could be pronouncing it wrong. It could be Warwick. It could be Warwick. So sorry to the locals. But when it comes to this particular suburb, a couple of things to point out is that firstly, pressure trends are super, super tight. But the second thing is that in this particular suburb, we're noticing a trend in this WA area overall, Perth in particular. We're noticing that the outer rings of these markets have seen strong levels of growth over the last 4 years and far more as a percentage in comparison to the inner markets of Perth and the middle rings of Perth. And this is creating some upsizer activity, people who even might not be upsizing, moving in the same type of home, but moving in rings closer, a bit of cash outs occurring. People are moving that money locally because we're finding a lot of owner occupiers are taking action in these higher price points between 700K to 1.2 million in Perth. And I feel that price point is the one that's going to continue growing stronger over the next 12 to 18 months for sure. In particular, Warwick is one suburb that's going to demonstrate that. And this is something that will start to shape itself all across Australia as interest rates do eventually come down. Perth is just starting to see this trend earlier. Adelaide is starting to show it as well. When these things start to happen nationally, I feel like we're going to start getting our quartile pricing separating. That's an important part, because you can't just keep having the lower market keep performing, because then the lower market isn't the lower market. The lower market's now the middle market, and you can't have them both the same. It's like, hey, would you like to live 50 kilometers out for 700K or 20 kilometers out for 700K? Like, what's your answer? So I think the key there is that we're going to see some changes in that ring of Perth.
I've seen this in a few areas around Brisbane, even in Adelaide. I was actually looking the other day. The gap between Morphett Vale and Woodcroft used to be huge. It's not that big anymore. And it's like, well, the chances of Woodcroft coming up is a lot stronger. So I hear what you're saying here. You're looking at Warwick not in a specific price range of like an affordability level, but you're looking maybe just a touch above where a lot of investors would typically jump in, because most of those affordability levels have been pushed up to a similar height. So now it's like, well, the knock-on effect is going to go into that second price point. That's kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. And these things take time, but I do think 2025 is the year where that starts to show, just because we're likely to have multiple rate cuts in 2025. And as a result of that, we're going to see capacity open up at higher price points, but we're also going to start to see the main thing, which is that upside the behavior, which is already kicked off. I do see that happening already a fair bit, especially when our national presence, we get to see a lot of what happens across the country at larger volumes, being one of the larger operators in the country. And we get to see that now the voices are changing as to who's picking up the stock, because in our role, we can't win every deal, because our job is to not overpay. It's to find the right price point. And when we hear the stories of what we're missing out to, it used to be a lot of, in Perth in particular, it's like investor. Now it's starting to be, especially in that 800K plus price point, owner-occupier. So I think that's going to be a big trend happening over the next couple of years. And I do think that it'll happen national, but for now, only a select few markets are showing it, and we will start to see it nationally in the coming years.
Got it, man. Anything else you want to say about Warwick before we move on to your top picks state-wise?
No, I think just reinforcing again that that's just Todd making my life hard to choose one suburb and one location. If it wasn't that, I'm always going to say, look, there's so many locations across the country with high pressure, and you got to look at it tailored to your portfolio.
Absolutely. And yeah, sorry, man, I like to make things challenging for you. So as far as the state that you feel has the highest chance of like the best capital growth moving into 2025, not suburb level, not LGA level, but the state, which one are you picking, mate?
Yeah, 2025 is still WA. So WA is still expected to be the highest growing in 2025. And this is something that I always think of going back to cycle analysis learnings that I've had. Yes, there's cycle analysis from I'd like to be in early in a market, and that would point me to places like Victoria as an example, or even some of the signals coming out of like parts of NT. But that is early markets. Like that doesn't mean the performance is high over 2025, right? You've raised the question of what's going to be the best performer in 2025. And that's actually quite easy to analyze. The best performance sits where the highest pressure sits. And many people think that the best performance sits where something will become something. No, the best performance typically sits where the market is something already and it's happening, right? So the stats will likely show WA becomes the winner for 2025. But as the years progress, things will switch, right? It doesn't happen overnight, but they will switch. It reminds me of many people who constantly made the mistake of analyzing market cycles wrong. For example, Hobart was a market where in 2016 really started picking up. And I can remember throughout the social, someone would say in 2017, it's done its thing, it's done its time. Then others would say in 2018, surely not, 2 years through, it's done it. 2019, look, I wouldn't be touching that. I mean, it's growing a fair bit. And you're like, how many 6 years in a row you want to say it doesn't grow and become the best performer when it has? And the same was said about Adelaide from 2019 onwards. Every single year, someone going, it's done its thing, it's the sleepy town, it won't do it. Growth occurs where competition is high and the pressure is the highest in WA, so the highest growth will occur there over 2025. And each year, it's about us assessing what the next year says, because forecasting accuracy cannot be something that you make out 3, 5, 6 years. So many things can happen. So many policies can change. So many data points can shift. So many local factors can shift. For example, we've just seen double the amount of immigration as we normally would have in the last 12 months than 4 years prior. Which model 4 years prior would have told you we'd have double the amount of immigration in 1 year in 2024? No model would have said that, right? So the key there is that we can forecast out pretty accurately over the 12-month period, and then it's about assessing that each year. And the data just says WA is going to be the top performer for 2025, and we'll see what 2026 has in store for us then.
Okay. So you're not saying that other states aren't going to do well maybe in the coming years, but in the coming year, your money's on WA, not because it's going to have explosive like 25, 30% crazy kind of growth, but because even if it does have 10 or 15% growth, like you're saying, that's still amazing growth. It's just the comparison to what it has done. It feels like less, but it's still going to be one of the top performers.
Absolutely. It's just a common mistake people make where they just look at the past in recent isolation and think, well, surely that must be done. If pressure's not changed and if pressure's not fallen off a cliff, yes, it's weakened, just like Adelaide weakened its pressure in 2023 and 2024, but it just weakened from super strong to strong. So I think that's the key thing to consider. It's not going from super strong to balance. That's the key thing.
Yeah, I think Arnie's like, 70? I still wouldn't want to arm wrestle him. He might not.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And or Sylvester Stallone's another one, and Jackie Chan will still kick some butt as well, right? So they might not be the strongest, but they're still pretty good.
Exactly. All right, man. So bottom pick, we're talking Holder ACT. Top pick, we're talking WA, and we're looking at Warwick. And as far as the top pick for the state, you're looking into WA. That's going to be where the hottest growth is for 2025. Arjun Paliwal, is there anything else you wanted to add to this, mate, before we part ways today?
No, look, I'd just say that's the picks there. And then the lowest state in terms of growth is likely to be ACT when it comes to the lowest performance. But when it comes to ACT, it's probably a close tie with Tassie over the next 12 months. And when it comes to that WA winning, it's going to be close with SA. So I think the key thing is to recognize that when something's considered the best in terms of growth for a year, A, is it right for your portfolio? B, are you looking to buy in that heat? Or are you looking to buy in earlier markets? And C, if you've already got something in that best one, can you diversify to another market that might not be far off and still get you the results? But yeah, that's my thoughts there. And I think we're looking to an exciting 2025 for the markets. Definitely not going to be as crazy growth in the recent year that we've had, but I do foresee some strong performance like there has been every year in something somewhere.
Love it. Arjun Paliwal from InvestorKit, mate. It's always a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks, mate. And I'll get back to Hawaii and we'll catch you soon, okay?
See you, mate.
See ya.
All right, so Arjun looking at WA, looking for Warwick, 700 to $1 million. Totally understand his price range reference there because it does make sense. A lot of the lower end of the market's already been pushed up and now the disparity isn't quite there the same way with that price range. Bottom pick looking at ACT, but as far as his top state for 2025 moving forward is WA. Going to be interesting to see if this keeps going for Perth. So one so far for WA being the top pick for 2025 moving forward. But right now, let's jump into it with Simon Liu from Housefinder to find out his top pick on the list, bottom pick on the list, and which state he's backing the most for 2025. Simon Liu, how you going, man?
I'm good. How are you, Todd?
Very good. It's that time of the year. Start talking about top 25 of 2025, mate. Can you believe it's already here?
I know. I'm counting down as we speak. Yeah, no, it's exciting time of year. It'd be good to reflect what happened in 2024 as well. I believe we did this at the end of 2023. Yes. So, yeah, happy to be back and talk about what I think is going to happen next year, I suppose.
Yeah, man. And looking forward to getting you back on to complete the rest of your episode as well about your buying 30, 40 or 50. I can't remember how many properties in 1 year as well, but
40.
Okay. But that's a whole nother discussion, but we'll get into that one on another episode.
We'll do an episode soon. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right, mate. So what is your top pick on the list suburb wise for 2025?
Well, when I did this a couple of months back or something very similar, I picked a suburb called Butler in WA, which is in the Wanneroo area on the north side of Perth. Not much has changed, to be honest. I noticed Butler was also on the list for this year, for next year, should I say. But there was another suburb called Merriwa, which is the suburb, just one suburb down from Butler. Now, why I think these areas are still good to go in terms of growth, it's basically, where else can you buy that 4-bedroom house, beachside suburb in a major capital city, still for $600,000-$700,000? There's literally nowhere else in Australia that you can do that in a big capital city. And these areas, like Butler, for example, has grown 30% in the past 12 months. Similar with Merriwell. Merriwell is slightly less. I think it's like 27% or something like that. But that's an indication to me that it's just getting smashed at the moment by people realizing I can live right next to the beach. Owner-occupiers, not investors. Owner-occupiers. I can live right next to the beach and still be within about 30 k's of the city, major capital city, for that kind of money. And these suburbs, not bad. They're not like working class feel or bad stigma or low socio at all. Like if you drive through them, go through them, they're just like any other suburb. In fact, it's starting to have more sort of premium feel to it because, you know, gentrification's really kind of taken place and really in the throes of that as well. So okay. I'm still definitely picking these suburbs. Yields have definitely dropped a bit due to the growth.
Just to quickly jump in, how you find rental demand to maybe fix those yields back up with the price growth? Is it still pretty strong? Extremely
high rental demand. The vacancy rates are still less than 1%.
Yeah, right.
I believe 0.7 or something like that last time I checked. You know, anything that goes online that we buy gets rented out within a week, you know, unless it needs a little bit of work. So, you know, they're just good, family-friendly suburbs. They're relatively close to the CBD. I mean, Merriwell is one suburb closer to the CBD, so that's got that going for it as well. So definitely that pocket, I think that entire sort of Wanneroo pocket will still continue to thrive over the next several years, I reckon. But I do have to mention one other area called Girraween, which is also in Perth. This was, I would say, an equal tie to Butlers and the Merriwells of Perth. Okay. Now, Girraween is, for anyone in Perth, it's known as the KGB region.
The KGB region, okay.
Not because
a lot of vodka sales there?
No. Not that at all. But there's 3 suburbs in that region called Kundula, Girraween and Balga.
Got it.
And these 3, why they call it KGB is they've had a notorious past of being pretty rough, pretty run down, pretty low socio kind of a pocket. Now, this, from my perspective, is actually part of the reason why I'm picking it as a pretty high-performing suburb, because Girraween is only 13 kilometres to the city.
Yeah, right.
And, you know, we're seeing houses there for still around about the 600K-ish mark, right? These are sort of 3-4 bedroom houses. If you look at all the stuff around Girraween, Kundula, Balga, and so on, houses are 900K, you know. So the price difference between these 2 neighboring suburbs, just because of this stigma, is too significant to ignore. So I think eventually these areas will come out of their past. They'll go through that same gentrification process that a lot of these sort of rundown areas always go through during a big boom run. And I think these areas will start to thrive as well, purely based on affordability to begin with, because people will usually, if we look at what happened in other cities that have grown a lot, affordability is the biggest factor of where someone chooses to live. And then they kind of put up with the sort of rundown feel of it. But eventually that changes with more and more owner occupiers moving in. So that's another area that I reckon is going to thrive.
So on that affordability piece then, where do you kind of see that cap playing out for both areas? Are you looking at this going like this is probably 25 is the last part of the run, or are you looking at this going, nah, this is potentially still got another few years left in it?
Look, I think Perth has a long way to go. I mean, if you look at comparatively, like, you know, if you look at like Melbourne or Sydney or even Brisbane now, you know, suburbs like Butler and Merriwell, they should be well above $1 million once the city sort of evolves into that kind of level of growth, right? Like, what suburb 13 kilometres out of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane is still 600K? And not well over $1 million. So I think just based on that, I mean, look, last year, or I shouldn't say last year, but in the past 12 months, 95,000 people migrated to Perth. So that's a lot of people that need houses at the end of the day. That trend is not slowing down.
Yeah.
And really the reason for that trend is because you can still buy these houses for 600-700K. Like even if you're a low income earner, this would still be considered somewhat affordable. So I don't see that trend lasting. A lot of people are very skeptical. I remember at the start of this year, there were all these, you know, property spookers and people coming out saying, oh, Perth is done. We've already seen all the growth. And Perth has been this year the highest growth city in all of Australia. I think it was like 25% or something, you know, across the board. Perth has grown. So, you know, we're about 4 years into the boom run. You know, I've never seen a big city like this driven by owner-occupied demand stop at 4 years. Usually it's a 10-year run I don't have a crystal ball, obviously, but just based on the fundamentals, I can't really see it slowing down.
Okay. All right. So we're talking about 600 to 700 grand. You're looking at a massive price difference between areas. So it's not like this is just good value in itself compared to other states. You're looking at this as good value compared to like a half a K down the road. So it's very comparable. Still strong yields, close proximity to the water, close proximity to the city. You've kind of got 2 picks in there as well. So we're looking at Girraween and Merriwa, if I'm pronouncing that right, for WA. These are your top pick. Perfect. Thank you. What about your bottom picks? What are you looking at on this list and just going, not even if you paid me, I wouldn't go with them?
I looked at the list and I'm like, there's so many. I don't even know what to choose, right? Like one stood out, Snug in Tasmania. It's kind of like a regional sort of little suburb in Tasmania. It's got a very high median price, low levels of demand, very high days on market, low yield, all bad indicators for growth. Mm-hmm. It's performed very poorly in recent years as well. But I think Tasmania as a whole is not going to be performing well. And, the metrics and everything, they don't show any signs of that changing, really. I mean, the state recorded one of the lowest median income earnings, according to the ABS. And also it's the slowest rate of population growth. And I think now more than ever, people are really choosing where they live based on how much money they make, with cost of living and everything. And, if like once upon a time, maybe living in Tasmania or living in a regional area or a smaller city would have been a very cute idea, a very romantic idea. But I think nowadays, people are making decisions based on what they need, first and foremost.
Got it.
So I can't really see. And Tasmania, as you know, during COVID went through such a massive boom run. A lot of Tasmania has actually gone back, in some cases 50%, because it's just unsustainable. There's just no jobs there. Who can realistically live in Tasmania long term? So I'm not a big fan of Tasmania as a whole, but little sort of one-horse towns like Snug, I don't know, might be a great place to be. It looks like, I had a quick Google and looks like it's right near the water and everything.
But not as an investment.
Probably for the 24 retirees that are living there, they'll be fine.
Tassie as a whole, out of interest, is this, do you reckon it's more so because it had such a big boom for such a long time that it's like it's time to leave? Or do you think economically it just changed so much and that's really what's making it like, nah, don't go there?
Tasmania hasn't changed economically. It's always been a tourism town. So you got the hospital, you got like a hospital, you got the university there, but everything else is really tourism based. Like if you work in accounting or an IT, I'm sure there's a few accounting jobs, a few IT jobs, but by and large, it's unsustainable for you to move there. And this is one of the reasons why I'm just not a big fan of small cities or let alone regional towns or regional cities. They just don't have the industry or the economy to sustain a large amount of migration. And that ultimately, that need for housing is ultimately what pushes prices up. But more importantly, for prices to stay there, so they don't just come tanking down the next day. So at the moment, there's a lot of people talking about Darwin. I don't know anyone. I've lived here in Australia for 35 years. I don't know anyone who's moved to Darwin.
I know a few people that have moved there, but they've all moved back.
They all moved back, and I wonder why. I mean, I wouldn't say like that's purely obviously jobs industry wise. I don't think that's sustainable. But I don't. If anyone hasn't ever been to Darwin, you don't know what the weather is like. It's almost unbearable humidity and heat and everything. It's not a great place to be unless you're a very specific type of person. So I just think they're safer bets. You know what I mean? And the safer bet has grown more. If you look at what happened in Perth and Brisbane and Sydney and all these other places that have grown, they've grown so much more. So why would you bother? That's one of the reasons why I'm choosing areas like Snug as the worst suburbs on the list. There's another one in called Malden, which is in Palmerston in the Northern Territory. Notwithstanding the name of the suburb, that might already be an indicator. But, these areas, if you look at the stats, I think it was like 120 days on market at the moment, for any house that's gone online. The vacancy rate's above 2%. Like there's just no fundamentals there at all for any growth.
And this is exactly why we put the list together the way that we did, because it's pressure markets, as much pressure as possible in each state and looking in all these regions. But all of this pressure is absolutely not created equally. So if you were just absolutely set on Tassie, it could lead you to maybe a bit of a false positive from what you're looking at, going, it doesn't matter that a few of these metrics are lining up. Look at all the other ones that really look bad at the end of the day.
Yeah, 100%. Just one other quick mention as well. I'd be very wary of regional New South Wales towns.
Okay.
Notice you've got Tamworth and Wagga and Albury in the list. I'm very skeptical because a lot of the reasons why these regional areas have grown in the past 20 years is because Sydney was so expensive. But now it's quite evident that Sydney is kind of tapering off a little bit. I wouldn't say dropping, but it's definitely at that very sort of very top glass ceiling of growth. And usually when the big city is there, all these sort of regional towns, they start to take a bigger drop because suddenly the demand, again, for people moving those into those areas is significantly less. So I'd be a little bit wary about that as well.
Okay. All right. Bit of cautionary tale as well. Mate, as far as the top states concerned, I feel like I already know the answer to this question, but which state out of all of Australia are you backing for 2025 as the highest growth?
I think Perth. Totally. Yeah. A lot of people aren't with me. They weren't with me at the start of this year. But like I said, Perth's grown the most in the past 12 months. Yeah, just led purely by migration. Always follow where people live. Always follow that and you'll be fine. So at the moment, most people are moving to Perth to live, and I can't really see that slowing down, at least for the next 12 months. So yeah, that's where I'm putting my money on.
I know how you feel about the smaller places, but how do you feel about places like Bunbury?
Not a big fan.
Not a big fan?
Bunbury, Geraldton, again, these are areas where there's no need. Like if you're like, let's say you're the young family moving out there from Sydney, why would you choose Bunbury over, Butler or Merriwa or Girraween even, like we talked about? Or if you wanted to be, even Mandurah, which is halfway between Bunbury and Perth, similar prices, you get the same kind of lifestyle by the water. But proximity. In proximity to the city.
Yep.
There's no reason why. So why would you take that bet? I don't get it. A lot of people are citing how Bunbury has grown a lot, but so has all the other parts of Perth. So there's kind of no reason to. Like maybe one day if Perth and all these areas that are within proximity to Perth are getting to that $1 million mark, and Bunbury and Geraldton are still like the 500-600K mark for equal like product, maybe there would be an argument similar to what Wollongong and Newcastle did in Sydney. Once Sydney got a bit too crazy, these areas started booming, then yes, there could be a case of people chasing that affordability and making that compromise. But I don't think for the near future, personally, I would stay away,
All right, mate. So perfect. We're looking at a top pick of Girraween, bottom pick Snug, and top state for 2025 is going to be WA, more specifically Perth. Simon Liu from House Finder, thank you so much again for jumping on the panel, mate. It's always a pleasure to see you on the show.
No worries. Good to be on.
So Simon's still seeing some pretty strong growth potential for WA, in particular that $600,000 to $700,000 range, and 13Ks from the city. I mean, it's kind of on the money there. I mean, you're looking at that kind of proximity to the city, and plus like some coastal areas. You're looking at $600,000-$700,000. There's not really too many areas in the whole country that you can actually see that, unless you start going like super regional. Obviously, totally different story. And Tassie, sounds like Tassie as a whole, he's staying away from, which I feel, and this is what the whole reason I asked the question with him as well, because is it like just because it's had its boom or is it economically it's changed? And it's like economically, Tassie's pretty similar to what it was when it was going through its boom period. But Simon's always been a much bigger fan of those stronger economies, larger centers where there's population constantly coming in, which again, looking at the population figures we're discussing with WA, or more Perth specifically, there's a lot of that there, hence his choices. And for our second pick on the list, we're looking at WA for the most chance of strong capital growth for 2025. So far, that's 2 for WA. We've got Arjun and Simon both picking it. Now let's jump into a slightly different look on the list through the lens of property development and chat with Rob Flux from the Property Developer Network. Rob Flux, you're always somewhere different every time I see you. How you going, mate?
Mate, I'm a man on mission. I don't know where home is anymore, but I think this is it. This is my pad in Brisbane, mate.
Okay, beautiful, mate. Well, I'm very pumped to have you on the show because you're going to offer a real point of difference that no one else is jumping into on our panel. So you're not just looking at this as like top picks, bottom picks for suburbs, just in a general investment sense. You're looking at this through a developer's eyes. But I feel that there's a few variations that you want to chuck into this because you and I have been having a bit of a chat off air. Why don't we actually just jump straight into it? Is there anything you want to set the scene with before we jump into it?
I might set the scene to say there are really fundamentally 3 reasons why you want to be investing. So one is capital growth. One is cash flow and the other one is manufactured profits. And that's where I'm playing, is the manufactured profits space. Now, when we're trying to manufacture profits, we tend to be buying in one market and selling in the other. So what we're wanting to be doing is almost be counter-cyclical. We don't want to be buying where there's a peak right now because we're paying at the peak of the market. We want to be buying at the bottom of the market. We want to be selling in the peak. So we're trying to project where the future is going. If I look at my crystal ball, what I'm trying to do is go, where is the market going to be selling in the future? Now, a typical investor is looking at a thing called a market indicator. And a market indicator is things like days on market, auction clearance rates, median house prices, those sorts of things. The problem with an indicator is it measures sentiment of the market approximately 4 months ago. Somebody had to think about selling, then go talk to an agent, then go prepare their house, then put a marketing campaign together, then have open houses, auctions, then there's a settlement date, and then finally you actually get to see the results. So when we look backwards at that sentiment has quite often moved on. I'm looking at market drivers, and I've got 16 market drivers, and they largely fall into 4 categories. One of those is population growth. The next one is, I guess, government spending, so infrastructure, that sort of thing. Then there's supply and demand. And then lastly, there's affordability. So when we look at all of those things, the 2 in particular that I'm going to pay attention to today, the, I guess, government infrastructure spending and population growth rates. And that's going to give me the pressure to say, well, where does the government want people to go? That's where they're spending all the money. And then where are they actually going? Proving that they're actually going there. That's going to tell me where the next hotspot's going to be.
Got it. All right. So using this then, Rob, so we're looking at like infrastructure, population growth. Why don't we jump into your top pick?
So I'm limiting this to the list that you gave me and trying to keep to the script. So I might have broadened this a little bit wider if I hadn't have been given that constraint.
Got it.
But when I look at the list that you've given me, there were fundamentally 5 regions that there was a cluster of suburbs that are actually doing really well. So what I've done is I've just dived into those 5 regions and put a little bit more effort into each one of those. So that was Wagga Wagga, Albury, Penrith, Tamworth, and Newcastle. And when I look at those, probably the biggest driver that I'm looking at is population growth, and more specifically population growth rates. So there's a couple of different resources that you can get to measure this. The councils will typically give you that as well, but there's one called Profile ID, which is a really good one for saying, what is the current population today? What is the projected population going to be in the future? Then we can actually calculate what is the annual growth rate on that population growth. And then there's a magic number. The magic number is 2.6. That is the average number of people who live in a home. So if we know what our population growth rate is, we divide that by 2.6. That will tell us how many dwellings are actually needed in the area.
2.6. I like it. Okay. And so out of the 5 that you've pulled apart on a wider sort of lens, what are we really diving into as far as, it doesn't sound like you're going to pick one suburb, but at least one sort of location within this proximity?
Yeah, I'm going to pick one region in particular, and then I'm going to dive deeper into that one region and go, well, what's actually happening in there and why is that actually starting to occur? So when I measure these, Wagga Wagga needs 226 dwellings per year over the next 25 odd years. Albury is going to need about 347 dwellings. Penrith, leading the pack, 1,399 dwellings. Then Tamworth needs 329, and Newcastle a close second at 554. But Penrith is clearly
the standout.
It's going to need 3 times more dwellings in those regions than anywhere else. So what I want to do now is deep dive into Penrith and go, okay, well, we know we've got a list of suburbs that are performing really well now, but what are the ones that are going to perform really well in the future?
Got it. Okay. And so out of the list then, is there anything that you look at and go, yeah, that's on there for Penrith? Or are you looking at that going, it's kind of roughly the right location, but not quite?
Well, rather than dive into the specifics of those suburbs and use that as a constraint, I've taken a wider view. I've gone to the, I guess, Penrith's local strategic planning statement. That is their projection for what they're going to be doing in the next 20 to 30 years. They know that they've got this huge population growth that's going to happen. They've got to herd the cats and work out where are those people actually going to go. And that drives where they're going to be spending their money, and which is the infrastructure side of things. Hence, I guess, the next layer of the 4 key drivers that I'm actually looking at. So where are they spending the money? And when we look at this as a I guess, a very overall approach anywhere, the majority of infrastructure goes into, I guess, the key one, transport. So we're looking at train line upgrades and metro station upgrades and highway upgrades and tunnels and things like that, because people want to get to and from their working, I guess, home to work and then back home again. So there's a greater driver that sits over and above this. So we've kind of drilled a little bit down. But Sydney has a metropolis of 3 cities strategic statement that basically says there's actually going to be 3 CBDs in Sydney over the next 30 years. So the current Sydney CBD, Parramatta and Penrith. So Penrith is going to get a huge population growth out of that, which is then driving down. So what we're doing is just diving a little bit deeper into the Penrith one. So when we look at that local strategic planning statement, there's some massive upgrades that are going to happen, and we want to be hanging around as close as we can to that transport. So there's transport and growth nodes. And so we're looking at what are the growth nodes that they're trying to push in this area. And there's fundamentally 5 of them. So St. Mary's, Warrington, Kingswood, Orchard Hills, and the Quarter. Those 5 are going to have huge amounts of infrastructure spent on them. They're going to be key strategic locations with, I guess, a good amount of connectivity, a good amount of industry, health precincts, universities, etc. And so massive opportunity, mate, for where are people going to go.
And if you had to pick one, could you do it?
Yep.
Which one?
St. Mary's.
St. Mary's. Okay. And why St. Mary's? I know we need to move on in a sec to your bottom pick on the list, but why St. Mary's in a quick nutshell?
It's because it's got the combination of everything. So the biggest thing that makes a growth node, really 3 things: major shopping, health precincts, and universities. St. Mary's got all of those. That's sitting for it.
Beautiful. Love it, Rob. All right. Moving on to the bottom pick on the list. Which one are you looking at and going, for 2025, this is probably not where I'd be doing it?
I'm going to make this a very broad general statement and regional. I just wouldn't do regional. And that is because it doesn't have the push for population growth. One of the biggest drivers of capital growth is supply and demand. And if there's not enough people going there, there's not going to be enough demand. Okay.
So for you, it's not an area specific or a suburb specific. You just wouldn't be developing regionally.
No, not from a development perspective. Now, it's not to say there's not deals, and it's not to say that you can't make money, but it's the risk of actually doing it. So if I be very cheeky, it doesn't really matter how well I identify that there's development potential. Doesn't matter how well I get my feasibility right. Doesn't matter how well I get run my project and get it within $1 of the projected profit. If I don't sell the finished product, I never get paid.
Got it. Yep.
And so I'm really looking at, is there going to be someone who takes up my finished product? And if I make a mistake and don't get the perfect product, is there going to be enough slack in the system, enough people that still want to live in the area that will pick up my not quite perfect product? So I'm trying to de-risk myself. And the only way to do that is when there's a huge amount of demand.
All right, so our bottom pick is pretty simple. No regional for developing. So, and it sounds like this isn't just a 2025 thing for you. This is like across the board, and totally makes sense as well, because if you don't actually have purchases for your end product, it doesn't matter how well you pull the trigger on all of the other steps in the process. But Rob Flux, if we're going to talk about your top pick for 2025, what state are you looking at where you think it has the most potential?
I think that it's a very close draw. I'm going to say New South Wales and more specifically Southeast Queensland rather than all of Queensland. And predominantly because of, I guess, the population growth of both of those particular areas. New South Wales I like because they've done a lot of things very sensibly from a planning perspective to allow for some fast track development side of things. So what they call CDC or complying development codes. So for smaller scale developers, it's much easier and much faster to get in, bypasses a lot of the standard council processes. For Southeast Queensland, there's a lot of things going for it with regards to interstate migration actually pushing up there. A lot of people leaving Sydney, a lot of people leaving Melbourne in particular to go to Southeast Queensland. And there's also international population coming in there. But the biggest one in there for the next 10 years or so is obviously the Olympics. So that will create a small bubble in the next little while that I fully intend to cash in on.
Love it. So we're looking at St Mary's for your top pick, anywhere regional for your bottom pick, New South Wales and / Southeast Queensland. If you had to pick one, which one would you go with?
Well, I'm going to pick Queensland, not because it's better than New South Wales, but because that's where I live. And I want to do deals where I live because it's much easier.
Okay, love it. Rob Flux from the Property Developer Network. As always, mate, it's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you, mate. See ya.
So Rob's looking at this from a totally different perspective. And this is exactly one of the reasons I wanted to get Rob on the panel, because he offers that real different perspective, but also from the future side of things. So depends. If you're looking at this just through the lens of, I just need to smash my capital growth for 2025, then some of the picks so far, maybe those are the areas that you need to be looking into. Whereas Rob's looking at this from more of a, okay, maybe 2025 is not going to be the best year, but because I'm a developer, my project's going to take 12, 24, possibly even more. Months, that is, 12, 20, 24 months, possibly even more. So where do I want to plant the seed now in 2025 that's going to have the best chance of really growing over those few years? So you can see why Penrith is at the top of the list for him. And regional, suburb, just regional. There's no suburb. Just don't want to touch anywhere regional. So that's a pretty simple one for Rob on the bottom end. It's not even on the list. But then at top state, New South Wales or Queensland, the first on the panel to actually pick Queensland, but a very close tie for New South Wales. So far we've got 2 for WA and 1 for Queensland as far as the top growth for 2025. Now it's time to chat with the founder of Suburbs Finder and data analyst at Gilbert Melgar to find his bottom pick, his top pick, and which state he reckons is going to do the best for 2025. Gilbert Melgar, how you going?
Good, mate. Good. Thanks again for having me.
Mate, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. I love an analytical mind that's put into the property market, mate. And it's something that you do very well, explaining why an area might be having a good chance of capital growth or potentially a bad chance of capital growth. And we're going to be covering off both of those in this section of the episode. So you've already combed through the whole list. We're going to be going through your top pick, your bottom pick, and which state you feel has the most steam to really grow in 2025. But before we get into your top pick, mate, is there anything that you really wanted to set the stage with this one?
Yeah, the list that you gave me was pretty huge, actually. So it took me a while to really, dig into it.
Yes, there's a lot of choice in there, man. So why don't we start with your top pick and see which one is the cream that's really risen to the top that you feel has got the highest chance of growth in 2025?
Well, my top would be the one from Queensland. So it's from Townsville. The suburb name is Mount Louisa.
So Queensland, Mount Louisa. Okay, and why Mount Louisa and Townsville?
It ticks most of the boxes that in terms of showcasing the relationship between supply and demand. Mm-hmm. So it has significant reductions in stock for sale, and the rent indicates a growing pressure on supply.
Gotcha. Okay, so you're looking at this thinking there's less stock on the market. It's going to put more pressure on the market, but then the rental growth is going to keep that yield nice and healthy. Have I understood you right?
Yes, that is correct. Plus, the median rent at the time of this recording is $535,000. So that's still relatively affordable. Mm-hmm. So affordability meets quality on the location. And of course, the rising population in Townsville drives demand for affordable and friendly housing suburbs like Mount Louisa.
Talk to me about the economy of Townsville, because I feel like that's one of the things that's always put it on a bit more of a pedestal as far as a regional town, that it's got some big investment going into it.
Yeah. There are. Well, one of the big projects and infrastructure happening in Townsville is the port expansion of Townsville and renewable energy projects, boosting the regional employment.
And boosting in what kind of numbers? Are we talking hundreds of jobs, thousands of jobs? What are we looking at?
We're looking at thousands of jobs. I can actually show you.
Yeah, good. Let's do a screen share. Sounds good.
So showing on the screen here. So there's a lot of, actually there's 24 infrastructure projects lined up, and some of them are currently have just completed. Some is already underway, and some has just been approved, and some are just in planning, right? So one of the things that I mentioned will create a lot of job opportunities. So one example is the Townsville University Hospital expansion, right? So it will create 1,270 jobs during constructions. And of course, it will create jobs during operations as well.
Yeah, you start adding up all of those operationals on the side. You got 300 there, 400 there. What is that? 443 there, 254. I can see this is really adding up to thousands very, very quickly.
Yes, and not only that, but the infrastructure project in terms of infrastructure and transport, it enhances the accessibility of the area.
Okay. So for everyone looking at Townsville thinking that this is maybe just a little bit of an investor-led boom, you're looking at the data going, no, this has really got legs.
Yes, exactly. I'm just basing it all on the facts and the numbers that I'm seeing and what are the projects happening in the area.
Any chance you could pull up anything about affordability? Because I can already hear someone in the comments section going, it's had its run, it's done. Like, why do you think it's going to keep going? Because Townsville has already had some pretty good growth. What makes you think that's affordable for locals to keep pushing that price up?
All right, let me just get into that.
All right, mate. So for anyone listening on iTunes at the moment, they can't see what's going on. Can you explain this data that's in front of us?
So this is the affordability index. So how we come up with this is we take the 30% of the annual income, and then we divide that with the current median house price within that area.
Gotcha.
So if it is within below 20 years, then it is relatively affordable.
Okay.
So looking at this one, Mount Louisa, it will take 15 years for a person to own the house.
Got it.
Or the property.
Okay. And so if we go back to like 2021, what was it towards the bottom end of that scale there? You can see. So it was about 10.
Yeah, that 10 years.
Got it. Then in 22, it went up to what, about 12-ish, that kind of thing, 11, 12. And now we're at 15.
Yep. Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
But you're looking at this going 20 is still a very comfortable level. Hence, there's still a lot of room to grow, whether it's borderless investors jumping into the market or locals actually still having that room to actually be able to afford like local dwellings.
Yes, that is correct. And supported by different other metrics such as sale listings, days on market. As you can see here, the days on market and sale listing has been trending down.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it has been trending down. So we can see here. Right.
All right. So everything's looking pretty hot for Mount Louisa for you on the list. What's the exact opposite? What's the one that you wouldn't go there even if I paid you?
That would be in a suburb in New South Wales named Shelby.
Shelby.
Shelby or Shelby. I don't know it's pronounced it right. Sorry if I did. Yeah.
Any local Shelbyvillians?
So the reason why is there's a declining buyer interest in that area. So potential buyers and renters are looking at other nearby areas. And one of the noticeable metric that I saw is that it has pretty much high level of crime score, which means 49 out of 100, which means crime happens most of the time and may inconvenience people within the area.
So 49%, or 49, can you help us understand crime score in a little bit more detail for anyone that's wondering?
So how it was calculated is a combination of the number of crimes that happen within the area, plus the severity of those crimes, because some crimes will just be pickpocket or crime happen in the property, right? But it factors in the severity as well.
Gotcha. Okay. So if there's a prolific amount of jaywalkers in the area, we're not as concerned as if it's cars getting stolen all the time. Yeah.
Exactly. So it will not inconvenience people within that area.
Yeah, got to stay away from those gangs of jaywalkers. But all right, is there anything else about Shelby that's making you go like, nah, it's not for me?
Well, the index of relative socioeconomic advantage score by ABS shows that it's a low social demographics within that area.
Okay. So for you, high crime, there's more supply, lower socioeconomic, and like lower socioeconomic sometimes is something I'm personally a real big fan of, but it's more so if there's a little bit more of that gentrification wheel that's starting to turn. But is there nothing in like the data that's suggesting that maybe that demographic shift is occurring in Shelby? It's like, no, this is kind of how it is and it's looking like it's going to stay that way?
No, none of the one, because it lacks significant employment hubs and major infrastructure developments in the area, which, supposed to attract residents or investors, but currently there's none.
Got it. All right. Moving on to the top pick state-wise for 2025. Gilbert Melgar, what state do you reckon is going to outperform the rest of Australia moving into 25?
That would be Queensland.
Queensland. Okay. And why Queensland?
Because the population is growing at an annual rate of 1.9%, right? It's now reached 5.5 million. So this growth is driven by strong interstate migration, and as people move to Queensland for affordability and lifestyle factors. Not only that, but to mention, the total infrastructure value is more than 50 billion in Queensland. And there are a ton of projects happening. One example is the Brisbane Metro project, and the other one is the Queen's Wharf Integrated Resort Development.
Can we put that in perspective with a contrast? 50 billion, like that just sounds like a huge number anyway. But what do other states kind of have undergo at the moment?
So the next one that I have was in Perth. So in Perth would be 34.6 billion total infrastructure value.
Wow, and that's the next highest.
Yeah, that's the next highest.
Right.
And then the next would be New South Wales with 30.9 billion infrastructure development value.
We're talking like 35, 40% more than New South Wales being spent in infrastructure.
Yes.
That's huge. Okay.
That is correct. Yeah.
All right. So
that is combined of government and private, including commercial developments as well. Yeah.
Gotcha. So Queensland is the state you're backing for 2025 because there's a ton of money being put behind it right now. Plus, it's the warmer weather with a lot more interstate migration. And is it overseas migration as well that's like pretty high for Queensland?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so lots more people moving, lots more money being spent. And as far as the pressure side of things, there's a lot of markets that have pretty short supply, but a lot of demand. I can see why Queensland's is your top pick for 2025. Mate, is there anything else that you wanted to add to this list, whether it's top suburb, bottom suburb, or top state for 25?
Well, I'd just like to add for Queensland, the combination of high population growth, insufficient day approvals, and significant infrastructure projects will highly likely lead to continued upward pressure in the median house price for 2025.
Love it. Gilbert Melgar from Suburbs Finder. As always, mate, it's fun having you on the show. Thank you so much again.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
So for Gilbert, Mount Louisa, we're talking about Townsville, still super affordable. I like the way that he pulled that apart as well. So we've got more of an affordability there and still a lot of room to grow, which to me, that's the first question that comes to mind. Whenever you're talking about Townsville, it's like, is this done its dash now, or is there still enough fuel left in the tank? And if it's a yes, why? So pulling into the data aspect and pulling away from the opinion aspect of that, it's one of the things I always like about chatting with Gilbert, and hence why the guy's created what he's created. And as far as I know, New South Wales, Shelby, the crime score is a really interesting one. Now, whilst you can definitely make a lot of money in lower socioeconomic areas, I've bought in places before where there's some questionable stuff going on, let's just say. Doesn't mean it's not a pick that can be a profitable asset and help you grow your portfolio, but I can also definitely hear what Gilbert's saying here. Is there's a lot of other economic factors that maybe aren't as strong, but when you've got so many better options to choose from. And again, this is kind of the whole purpose of the list. Like I said in the introduction, these are the top pressure areas for each state. And it's about really understanding the importance of opening up your mind and looking at, just because if you're looking in your own backyard and you found these pressure and you're like, wow, look at this. Does a market are lower than everything else around it. Inventory levels lower than everything else around it. Rental growth is getting a lot higher than everything else around it. It's about widening that focus of comparison, because sometimes the best deal isn't found in your own backyard. And looking at it this way, so far, if you're living in ACT, South Australia, so far from what we're looking at the list, New South Wales, Victoria, 2025 might be the year to look outside your own backyard. And speaking of which, Queensland as well is going to be the top state on Gilbert's pick moving into 2025. Now, why don't we round things off with Mr. Sam Gordon, founder of Australian Property Scout, to find out his top pick, bottom pick, and which state he's backing the most for 2025. Sammy Gordon, good to see you on a panel, man. How you going?
Buddy Sloan, mate, it's always a pleasure to join you in studio, mate, or virtual like we're doing right now, man. So absolute pleasure, mate. Thanks for having us.
No, not a problem at all. Very keen to see what your picks are on this. Areas aren't something that you often dive into on the show with us. I know you do a little bit on your own show, mate, but pretty keen to see your top pick, bottom pick, in which state you're backing the most for 2025. Anything you wanted to sort of set the stage with before we jump into it, mate?
Mate, I think the big thing to look at, the way that we kind of look at this and the way I was kind of thinking about this as well, man, is it's what, in terms of biggest growth potential for this year, it really comes down to momentum. So a lot of the time in terms of where I'm looking at markets and everything, man, if we're looking at where's probably going to perform the strongest, a lot of the time it comes down to that momentum. When that market momentum builds, that's where you can have a massive year of growth. If we look at Perth this year and the result it had this year, some suburbs doing literally 40-50% this year, it was due to the momentum that built up through the stock depletion. And then obviously the pickup in activity over the past 2 years that led to this year being a whopper. So that's pretty much how I'm looking at this, man. And that's why I thought, you know what, I'm going to weigh in for once, man. I know you always ask, and I thought, here we go. We'll first time around, man. Let's see where we go.
I like it, man. And I like the description of Perth being a whopper. I don't think that superlative's thrown around enough. But why don't we jump into your top suburb then on the list?
Take that out, mate. I love it.
2025, man. What's your top pick on the list?
My man, I said to you before we jumped in, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky when I start. And the reason for it is I couldn't pick between two in particular that I thought showed a lot of premise and a lot of promise. Okay. So are you okay if I throw a double in the mix?
Man, just about everyone is. All right. But there's going to be one that we print like as your definite in the booklet. But yeah, chuck in a couple. Go for it.
Dude, my double, man, the two that I'm looking at probably the most closely, Douglas is the biggest one. Douglas in Townie. One of the biggest reasons, man, is Townsville's got some really, really strong market dynamics and some momentum behind it at the moment. So if we look at the same sort of illustration that I gave at the start around Perth, very much the same thing. If we look at both Douglas and the next suburb I jump into as well, man, both markets have started their run and they're what I call a running market. But if we look at what is probably going to outperform this year, these two are my top picks, man. The biggest thing when I look at Douglas, man, super, super tight inventory. If we look at its growth rate compared to the rest of Townsville as well, it has lagged a tad in it from that perspective, which in my opinion means it's probably got a little bit more, like a little bit of an extra spurt or a jump in the tank to come as well. I think the whole of Townsville is going to do really well. There's a lot of money going into that economy, man. The vacancy rates are super tight. Stock levels are super tight. Actual build approvals coming through as well. Very, very low as well. Ridiculous amount of money going into that economy right now too. And I just think, man, it's got a lot of promise behind it. And the momentum that's coming through that market, I believe it will do a big year.
Fantastic, man. So, and you've got another one in Townsville as well, or we're talking a totally different area? Totally
different area, man. If we look at regional Queensland again, man, obviously it's been on a pretty good run the last couple of years. And if we go down a little bit further down the coast, man, we end up obviously in Rockhampton. Rockhampton's had a pretty good run, a pretty strong run the last couple of years. But what I found, man, really one of the big things that we noticed was the suburb of Gracemere, just outside of Rockhampton. It was a little bit lagged in the growth run. It started a little bit later. The affordability is actually ridiculously strong in Gracemere compared to Rockhampton. Even Rockhampton is still very strong itself. But Gracemere in particular, it's more of a newer suburb on the outskirts, man. It's actually quite a large suburb. It's a big population that's there, and it's only a little bit out of town. Mostly new development there, but it has been built over the last 20 years. So it's very established, even though it is a newer sort of style area, which also means you're going to get a better quality of housing. But the actual affordability rate, so if you look at the affordability of Douglas in Townie compared to the averages, same as Gracemere compared to Rocky, against the averages of the whole town as well, the affordability is still super strong. Both of them have very low, long, like that 10-year average annual growth rate as well. And its rate of growth compared to the rest of the council, same for both suburbs in both of their respective councils, leave me with a pretty strong inkling that I think they're going to outperform this year and have another big surge this year as well. So I'm really intrigued to see how both these markets go. Yeah, man. And if I was to pick my two top picks for rate of growth for 2025 from your list, these are what give me the most probably confidence.
Now, before we move on to the bottom picks on the list, for anyone that's listening going, Townsville's had its time in the sun, Sam. What are you talking about? It's done its run. Rockhampton's done pretty well over the past few years as well. What makes you go like, no, we're not at the top yet?
Man, I think a lot of people were kind of calling that or looking at that at the end of last year with Perth as well. And then, man, we saw a 10 to 20% jump in the Perth market in that time frame. The biggest thing you look at is stock on market and those inventory levels, man. Super, super low, super, super tight. Still a huge amount of demand in that area. Man, I do think it's had a lot of run, and I'm not like, am I calling it like my pick for the next 2-3 years? Like, do I think it'll outperform over the next 2 to 3 years? No, I think other areas will do better. But if I look at like what is probably going to produce potentially the strongest growth rate over 2025 in a singular year in isolation, I think everything stacks up with these two areas. For one, I think there's a room there to do a surge and to do a jump and play a bit of catch up compared to the overall area. And for two, man, just that rate of affordability, still super tight vacancy rates, yields still quite strong for what they are as well. Yeah, man. And if I look at that year in isolation, I definitely think there's a lot of room for outperformance.
Because what's the yield there in like Gracemere? Like you're talking like 6% as an average, aren't you?
I think Gracemere, depends what sort of product you're looking at. The lower tier of housing in the older part of the area, yeah, you're still getting around 6%. If you're buying the newer 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom stock, you're hovering closer to around about the 5%.
Still strong,
but man,
though.
like, yeah, it's still strong, dude. Like you look at Perth, man, Perth's dropping like very much around the 4%, right? I mean, you look at Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, all these sorts of areas, they've dropped off a cliff, right? Like in terms of where that piece is sitting at. So I still think there's definitely room in both those suburbs and both those councils, but both those suburbs, man, I still think there's run there.
Okay, why don't we jump into the absolute opposite? What's your bottom pick on the list, man? Have you got a few as well, or is there just one? Yeah,
bro. This was really hard for me to pick because for me, like so much of what I choose when I look at an area comes down to affordability metrics and how much we actually think has left in the tank. And if we look at the opposite end of the spectrum from a yield perspective, the same as we're kind of talking about those two there. If you look at like Penrith and Newcastle, man, very, very low. I'm not a big believer in Sydney yet. I think it's still got a bit of time to. I just think it's had so much growth over the last like decade. I find it very hard to believe that those areas will outperform compared to the averages. It's also not somewhere I'd put my money now for probably like the best result over the next 1, 2, 3 years, especially like that 2 to 3 year horizon. But if we're looking at markets in isolation for a 12-month window, which is probably how I'm looking at this thing the most, then yeah, man, between Penrith, Newcastle, Hobart, I don't know exactly which one to probably boil it down to, man, but I don't like any of them, to be honest. I wouldn't be putting my money personally in any of those.
And just to drill down a little bit further, so this is more so not because like it's not going to do well, but it's because it's done so well. And again, looking at the isolation of 2025, you don't see any real signs of like a big price jump in the next year because of all the growth that it's had previously. Is that?
Yeah, man. And I don't think the momentum's behind it right now to produce a big stellar 2025. Yeah, man. And I think one of the biggest things we look at, if you take Hobart out of the picture because, and almost Tassie as a whole, because yields are still decent there. Vacancy rates are still very tight. Yields are still decent there. So if you probably maybe move that out as my lowest pick, but again, man, like you look at the growth rate that most of Tassie has had between 2015 and 2023, 2022, the back end of COVID, dude, most of the areas is like 150 to 200%. It's like the likelihood of it outperforming again and again, that longer extended growth period run, like whether you look at in isolation, that longer period, I don't see it there. I'm just not a fan of say Penrith, Newcastle, man. At this point in time, I think there's a longer lag period that's going to come, especially as we extend out. Yes, interest rates may come back in the next 12 to 24 months. I just don't believe it's going to be that longer term performer as well that some of these other areas, man, it's a funny thing because we've got to keep looking at it like whether it's the year in isolation or whether it's the extended period of time as well. Yeah, man. So it's they would be my bottom picks.
Got it. And out of interest and slightly off topic, but still kind of on it, 12 to 24 months interest rate reduction. Your money on more so in the 12 months, or you reckon we still got a while and it's going to be more like the 24 before we see a drop?
Before we see the first drop?
Yeah.
I'm pretty confident with the drop will come this year, like in 2025. Man, I think it's going to be interesting to watch how it plays out because in reality, man, the RBA is always playing that fine game of keeping them where they are for as long as possible to achieve the outcome versus then still making sure the economy is still moving as well. Man, it's all going to come down to inflation when those inflationary numbers come in and we're all literally hazarding a guess as to when that's going to happen. Like it's crystal ball gazing. I do think it's going to be in 2025. I never called 2024. A lot of people were talking 2024. I was always pretty bullish. It was going to be early 2025. This is even at the start of 24. It's just going to be a piece of string, man, in terms of like when does inflation come back into the band? And I don't think interest rates will come back at all until that happens. So it's interesting, but I read an article the other day, someone else saying, well, there's 7, effectively Labor-backed politicians sitting on the board of the RBA as well, Labor-backed, people sitting on the board of the RBA as well. Like, will they have an influence on a rate reduction coming earlier? It's an interesting thing, man, trying to really call how that plays out. There's so much at play here. But yeah, Michelle Bullock seems to be doing a good job, man. Holding pretty firm and being pretty open with how she's looking at things and how she thinks that things are going to play out. So we'll see, man. All we can do is see.
Yeah, a bit of a rate relief wouldn't be too bad, but I tend to agree with you on that one, man. Everyone that's thinking that we're going to see a big drop in 2025, I'm not really sure it's going to. I'd love to be wrong on that one.
Oh.
But
man, all of our portfolios would absolutely skyrocket. But I think I think ultimately the government, the RBA knows that. It's going to be very closely linked to house price movement. And we're in, there's the big uproar around the housing crisis. I got blasted just recently about it as well.
Yeah, you did.
You know what I mean? You know what I mean? So it's like, I think like that's only going to bring more into the equation. Yes, rates make it cheaper to buy property, but it will 100% surge prices again.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, man? They sort of ran after you a bit of a witch hunt.
They came pretty strong, man. The first week they came hard. The second week they backed me, and then the third week there's a few people that had some pretty big shots. Daily Mail was the big one. I'm just pulling bush headlines as well, and then you read the story. It's actually completely different to the headlines. In reality, man, it doesn't faze me at all. Like we're in the wealth creation game, but for two, the government went out of social housing in the 70s and 80s. They literally turned the plate, or the door was open for investors. That's what they wanted to do. They incentivized investors to come in. The government knew there was going to be a period of time where they weren't going to be able to provide all this social housing and the pension and all the rest of sort of stuff and provide all these different things. Like we're not a big enough economy. We're a huge country and we're a very small population to provide like what is expected to provide. It was never going to happen, right? They were never going to be able to afford to do it. So they privatized, housing and rental, man. And like realistically, 30% of the country is owned by investors. So whether someone owns 100 properties, whether 100 investors own one each, or 10 investors own 10 each, or whatever, it's irrelevant, man. Like we all in Australia, man, we've all got the ability to do whatever whatever we decide to do and whatever dreams we decide to chase. If we're willing to put the work in, man, I honestly do not care about anyone's opinion about that.
I always do find it funny when they say like investors are the one pushing prices up. Like, have you ever overpaid for a property? Because I don't.
Not.
I'm not pushing them up. If anything, I'm pushing them down. Anyway, man.
And it's all part of it, man. Ultimately, like rentals are a big part of Australia, man. 30% of properties are owned by investors and rented out by people. Dude, I still rent, and it's people at all different levels, in the marketplace need property. And realistically, man, like most of what I provide is in the bottom end of the market. It's affordable housing, you know what I mean? And a lot of the time, man, I'll buy rundown, dilapidated, unlivable products and either knock it over and rebuild actually livable things or renovate that back to a standard, build a secondary dwelling, all sort of stuff. So all the time I'm actually taking 0 livable properties and turning it into 1, 2, 3. So man, I 100% believe that we are a solution. We're providing, housing from that perspective. And mate, they can write as many as they want. They're not going to faze me. I've worked too long, too hard, too many years of hard slog for anyone to try and throw stones and actually affect me when it comes to what I've built for myself. And what we're helping clients build as well, man. I'm only proud of each and every person that's doing it.
Totally agree with you, man. And I don't know, that was another tangent on top of a tangent. So I want to bring things back. And why don't we start talking about the top state for 2025? Which one are you backing the most to see the highest growth for 2025?
Bro, it's a hard one, quite honestly, because I've got a couple of up and comers that I'm really bullish on, but I think the ones with momentum will probably take the cake as an overall state performance. And then I'd have to go into the momentum building markets, or the market's still in momentum. For me, it's got to be between WA and Queensland that I think are going to outperform. Even though WA is definitely cooling off and slowing down, stock is still at 50% of the levels that it was 4 years ago when the market first started its run. So I still think it'll be in a state of growth. Would I be buying into that market? No. But if we're looking into the isolation of 2025 and the growth rate, which in my opinion, man, everything I've spoken about here is talking about what I believe is going to be produced in 2025.
Yep. Not 5-10 years.
Yeah, exactly, man. And yeah, it's different, right? So I look at markets, up and comers and runners. And for me, talking about what is going to produce the most, I always talk about runners, right? So things are going to be doing it. So yeah, man, I think it's going to be between WA and Queensland. I think there's still a lot of momentum in Queensland. Again, it is slowing. It's not going to produce a year that it produced this year and last year, but I still do think it's going to produce a rate of growth. When you look at it compared to a lot of other states, man, too many areas and too many other states, I think, will hold the growth rate back of an overall state, right? So if we're looking at this, and that's why when I was thinking about this, I'm like, well, if we're looking at it from a state perspective, I think the momentum of, again, you look at WA, man, and that whole region of Perth stretching to the north and then, all the way down to the south into Mandurah as well, man, it's still all in a state of growth. And so I think the overall momentum of what will be produced from that market, I think it will be up there. It's going to compete with Queensland, but still a lot of these areas that are still producing big numbers. I still think a lot of these regional areas are going to produce 20% growth this year, just because of the momentum that's behind it and the amount of activity that's still there and how tight stock is. And man, so many sellers that are just being like, no, I'm not selling at this money. Like, this is still what I'm selling at, or this is still what I want. And they just won't sell it. So they don't get it. So it's interesting, man. And it's a funny thing picking like a top pick for 25 and the bottom picks for 25 and everything as well, man, because it's like, again, we're looking at a year in isolation, which I never do when I'm actually buying property, right? So I think there's a lot of things to think about with that. And I think with that statement as well. But yeah, man, I think, they overall, dude, they're my picks. State-wise, WA, Queensland, I think momentum will take them to the top. And suburb and I guess LGA-wise, you've kind of got my picks as well.
If you had to pick one of them, WA or Queensland, which one would you back? If you're forced to pick one.
I probably would still pick WA.
Still pick WA.
I think the momentum's there and I think their regionals are still performing and I still think Perth will produce growth this year. So I think overall that state, because it's so solidified within several markets, I think it will produce the best.
Okay. And I feel like I have to just reiterate the caveat that you just put in there as well. This is for 2025, not for the rest of the next 5-10 years going forward as well. Matt, Sammy 100%. Gordon from Oz Property Scout, thank you so much for jumping on the show, mate. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Thanks, Toddy. Appreciate having me, buddy. So
forever the deal maker. I mean, most people have been like this as well. Give one option. It's like, can I have two? That's the sign of a good negotiator. So looking at Queensland, looking at Douglas in Townsville, Gracemere in Rockhampton, and really pushing the growth for 2025 for those to keep going. But again, this is what I actually like about chatting with Sammy about it. This isn't necessarily about these are the best areas that are going to be killing it over the next 5 or 10 years, because maybe there's areas that are going to be set for more growth, but they're still very much in their early adopter phase. But an area that he feels pretty strongly about that isn't going anywhere in 2025 and possibly even a bit after is looking like Penrith and Newcastle. I find this interesting with the contrast of the development opportunity that Rob's looking at. Just going, this is it, it's going to kill it. But it's not killing it right now. This is the place to plant the seed if you're really wanting to reap that long-term crop. But again, the question is 2025. So for Sammy, he's looking at areas like this going, but I don't see him going anywhere in 2025. And then overall, between WA and Queensland, it's WA, which he's backing the most. But by the sounds of things, only by an absolute hair. So coming down to as a total, we've got 2 for Queensland, 3 for WA, and the rest of the states not even getting a mention as far as the best places for capital growth in 2025. You want to get your hands on the full list as well. Make sure to click link in the show notes below. We're going to be making more episodes like this because I think it's great to have lists created, pressure lists, yields lists, whether it's got to do with developing, renovating, anything that's going to help with a narrow strategy that you guys are wanting to focus on, because it's all about portfolio growth for us at Pizza and Property. And for you, if you're listening, if that's the focus that you keep, I want to build a portfolio. Does this help me keep building my portfolio? This is absolutely the show that you're going to want to keep listening to. And if you haven't, if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify right now, make sure to hit that follow button so you don't miss an episode, because we're going to have even more stuff like this coming up in 2025. Every year, we've kicked it up a notch to keep improving the quality. And this is going to be a different year. Not because we're not kicking it up a notch, but we're going to be kicking it up several notches to keep bringing you guys the best property investing content in the country. And if you want to have a chat with any of our experts as well, I'm sure we'll have links to everyone in the show notes below. And you got a comment you agree with, you disagree with, or you just want to have a chat and say, hey, thanks for the episode. I'm enjoying this stuff. Whether you're on Spotify or YouTube, leave it below. But it's time to plan a big 2025 and smash those property investing goals.